Trex.
Omar.
I cannot believe it. I cannot believe what just happened.
I know.
Because you're here, and we made the announcement, the historic announcement. We're only adding one other co-host / co-owner, which sounds like a positive thing until you find out that Iron Culture is just absolutely riddled with massive debt. So it's more like you're taking upon yourself a burden. But we're adding one more person. So it's a trifecta now. Some would say Trinity, but we're atop a pyramid. And that is Eric Trexler has joined Iron Culture. We had your first official episode as a co-host last week. And to say that it went off well would, quite frankly, be an understatement.
Well, I mean, the returns are in. The people have spoken, and they know what they like, and they know what they want.
Yeah, and they like Eric, and that is the thing that we knew.
The one true Eric. Yeah.
No, this is going to be the battle. It's going to be. Yeah. I know you don't like pop culture films, but it's going to be like the film Highlander, where there could only be one. My man has stepped in because shout out to our boy Eric Helms, who's currently competing, and congratulations to him for his showing at a very competitive show the last few weeks. Actually, by the time this comes out, he has another show. So the man's doing the damn thing. And so Trexler said, ain't no thing. I could co-host this. Came in like the professional that he is, absolutely obliterated it. And Trex, we're going to do one of my favorite segments, and that is read a few of the comments, because there were almost 30, which to some people, like if you're part of the Joe Rogan experience, you're like, that sounds abysmal. For Iron Culture, that's actually low-key good. Like the views.
Pandemonium.
Some would say, yeah, it's pandemonium. So can I read for you, Trex, some of the comments, and you just give like, one sentence or paragraphs or an essay, doesn't matter, reactions to some of the comments.
Yeah, I'll try not to blush. Let's hear them.
Fantastic. Okay, so we announced, I said, please help officially welcome Dr. Eric Trexler as one of our new, as our new third host of Iron Culture. And then people said a massive welcome. Welcome to my fellow Eric. That was Eric Helms actually saying, welcome to you.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I think he's trying to project a posture that he's not threatened, he's not worried. I can see through that. Mm-hmm. That's all I'll say.
That's all. And Trexler's like, also, well, that's not all I'm saying. 2024, I'm stepping on stage. But anyways, continue, Omar. Lindsay, who I've seen her leave several comments, said this, capitalize, is why I was excited by him joining. He's a great communicator and hilarious, all capitalized. I also appreciate the bit of Trex lore we got in the beginning. He has a real interesting origin story, and I wholeheartedly agree.
Well, see, there's more where that came from, because we started that story at the age of 12. I mean, there's an entire there's an entire prequel that we haven't even cracked open yet. So lots more of that coming.
Someone else said, I was missing this Eric so much. Finally,
indeed. Yeah, I'm back, and some say better than ever.
I would agree. And someone said, and this is true, I love how articulate this dude is. Close second is the dry sense of humor, extroversion, and narcissism, the quotation that you said, what it takes to be like either a host or like just participate in the space.
Yeah. I'll take articulate. I've been studying words almost all my life. Even before I could speak them, I was paying attention, kind of absorbing them. So glad to hear that I'm using them effectively. That's what you aim for.
And then two final ones, Trex, and then we'll go on. And you could go ahead and leave a comment below on YouTube, because we are trying our best. We do read some of the reviews. We're trying to interact. We do genuinely appreciate everyone. It's been almost now 5 years. It's going to be in January since we launched Iron Culture. Yuppie said, the host, Eric, just keeps getting more handsome. I request hiring a third PhD who's a nutrition professional and named Eric, and giving Omar the boot from the show. And let me just say, if we could find a third Eric, I'm down for it.
So this is a true story. When I was at UNC working on my PhD, we were absolutely riddled with Erics. Like some would say infested, our department. Not everyone was nutrition focused, but it really was getting absurd. I think there were probably maybe 5 Erics who were either faculty or PhD students at the time. And it was like everywhere you looked, there was another Eric coming in to do some kind of exercise study. So honestly, if you wanted to add 3 more Erics with relevant expertise, I could get them like tomorrow.
Uh, so, Trex, how would you respond to this? I may have said this in an episode before when we announced that you're coming on board, and I was very excited. But I said one of the parts I like most about Eric Trexler is that he's squeaky clean, that I have it on good authority that he may or may not have been grown in a vat, just because he's actually only 5 years old from a biological standpoint in terms of, you just like came onto the scene fully prepared. I'm sorry, I'm going to go on this tangent, Trex. One of my favorite, it's a dystopian graphic novel called Transmetropolitan, but it deals with a lot of socio-political issues. It basically is a parallel of some American politics. Warren Ellis, I think, is a brilliant writer. But anyways, there's a controversial presidential candidate. And in order to have someone that they could run with, they essentially grow this person in a vat. So there's no bad backstory. There's nothing they could dig up whatsoever. And it finally comes out. And I'm not saying that you're grown in a vat, but I'm just saying that your reputation precedes you. And so I would like to apologize for saying that.
No, I think it's totally fine. I took it as a compliment. But yeah, if we, let's say hypothetically, we meet up in Toronto or maybe in my neck of the woods, we go to a trivia night, you will think I was produced
that's what I said
within the last couple of weeks, because I do not know anything. I have not necessarily participated in society for much of my life.
That's what I'm saying.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's evidence to support your claim.
Yeah, there's a very curious admission in terms of just very general pop culture knowledge that anyone that grew up here in the last 20, 30, or 40 years would be aware of on some level. But it's interesting. When they're downloading, I said, or maybe it was Helms that said, when they're downloading everything into your consciousness, they're just like, put the data, the science, the math, the this, the that. It's like the pop culture, kind of transfer file, the extension. They're like, it's useless. Leave it alone.
Yeah, it does kind of, I don't know if it surprises or frustrates my wife, but I actually know a lot about movies, and I haven't seen any of them, which it's why she's like, what's happening here? But my brother was really into movies, and so just from hanging out with him my whole life, I actually do kind of know a lot about a lot of movies that I've never seen. And I also listen to a podcast about movies, which is weird because I've never seen any of them, but all that is to say, with movie stuff, I'm good. Television, I got nothing.
What a guy. Okay, final one. And this is actually kind of relevant to the topic. So the topic we're discussing today, and also so I'm framing it. Framing is very important, very positively, Trex joining. And that is 100% true. There is a little bit of controversy, however. So someone said, are you guys looking at hospice care for Dr. Helms? Well, with his permanent debilitating condition and poor quality of life, now that you have a backup Eric, this could be the best time. So if you remember, the last episode Trexler was on.
The last one, let's see, that was several. We were talking about metabolic adaptation and exercise energy compensation.
Exactly. And now this episode today, Trex, we're about to talk about.
We're going to be talking about testosterone.
Yeah. And also nutritional changes as they relate to testosterone. We'll also be taking a look at people in a caloric restriction that are relatively lean as one of the cohorts. Now, some said from the previous episode about exercise energy compensation, it was revealed that when Eric Helms got his BMR measured and it was absolutely in the toilet, that episode, the first one that Trexler did, was kind of him trying to do a solid to Helms. Like, hey, man, take a look at what you're doing. And this one, once again, it does deal with testosterone. It does deal with nutritional changes. It does discuss, lean men and the impact on their testosterone as they attempt to get leaner. And so people can say, and that's why we need to come in front of this, Trex, that we're bringing this new host on, and it seems like he's choosing topics that are directly aimed at one of the other hosts. Like, how would you respond to that?
I would tell people to chill out, reserve judgment. Next week, we're going to be talking about baked goods. I'm going to be talking about all the favorite ones I've had in the last week.
Nice.
So wait until these shows really, let us string some together before you decide that I'm taking jabs at Helms, poking fun at his physiological state and all the delicious treats that he's missing out on.
Yeah. And the episode after that is entirely unrelated to anything dealing with Helms. It is a recap of the 2023 Battle of the Bay Natural Bodybuilding Show. We had that one ready in the pipeline for literally months, and then it turned out he's competing at that show. So it's not related whatsoever. We want to give a shout out to our hunky co-host. And with that, maybe Trex, let's kick it off, man. Let's kick off this topic because this is very fascinating. There's something inside of it. I want you to lead, but we're talking nutritional changes and their role concerning testosterone levels. We talk about caloric restriction, but we also talk, concerning individuals with higher BMIs, some of the assumptions, the muscle building potential therein. But there's a lot of interesting things to unearth here. So I don't know where you want to kick it off, man, but I'm here for it.
Let's kick it off with the science, Omar. That's what we're here for, right? So testosterone, everyone loves testosterone. And when you think about testosterone as someone who's interested in lifting, the one thing you definitely know is you want more of it, right? I mean, we think of what it looks like when people use anabolics. They get awfully big and strong. And so a lot of folks who are natural lifters say, okay, anabolics not really in the cards for me because I'm planning to stay natural, but what can I do to get me some of that testosterone? And so people start to look into all sorts of different potential strategies. And one thing that's gotten some attention recently is how might I potentially modify my diet in order to boost my testosterone or maybe support optimal testosterone levels. Those aren't necessarily the same thing in terms of how you would define those phrases, but that's generally the two areas where people are focused is, what can I do to maybe get more of this stuff or at least do my best to support kind of optimal levels for me. And so a lot of folks, when we talk about dietary modifications, one of the first places that people go is, well, let's talk macronutrients, right? A lot of folks, the main way that they kind of view their diet, speak about their diet, interact with their diet in terms of, tracking and monitoring is going to be through macronutrient intake. And so there have been a few meta-analyses within the last few years that have shed some light on how dietary changes related to macronutrient intakes and even total energy intake might affect testosterone and really sex hormones in general. Because what we see with testosterone in males, we pretty much see an analogous situation looking at estrogen levels in females. So the first meta-analysis that kicked this off, it was by an author, the lead author's name was Whitaker. And the first one was in 2021. And all three of these meta-analyses are all by Whitaker and colleagues, which is hilarious. And the reason it's hilarious is because some folks will try to cherry pick around these three meta-analyses. And so that'll make more sense when we get into the results. But anyway, Whitaker did a meta-analysis in 2021. It was called Low-Fat Diets and Testosterone in Men, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Intervention Studies. And so basically what they were looking at was short-term diets, 2 to 10 weeks in duration. And they had to be kind of comparing a low-fat diet to a higher-fat diet in men. And the main thing they were looking at was androgen levels. And specifically, I focused a lot on testosterone when I was reviewing this in the Mass Research Review. They looked at total testosterone, free testosterone, DHT, urinary testosterone. So they looked at a few different androgen-related outcomes. But total testosterone is the one that kind of got the most interest. So with this meta-analysis, it was a very small meta-analysis. So talking about 6 studies that met eligibility with 206 total participants among those studies. So this is by no means a very large study or a very large meta-analysis, I should say. Sometimes, you look at some fields in areas that are very well researched and, you'll find meta-analyses that have tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands participants across dozens and dozens and sometimes even hundreds of studies. So very small meta-analysis, but an interesting meta-analysis. And I think the main takeaway that everyone was really interested in was it looked like, based on the results here, that a short-term fat-restricted diet, so in this case, the average of the high-fat diets was about 39% of calories, The average of the low-fat diets was about 19% of calories. I think the way that they actually defined it in their inclusion-exclusion criteria might have been like, how do they do it? Okay, yeah, they needed to have in relative fat intakes that differed by at least 10 percentage points. So like, if the low-fat diet was like 20% fat, the high-fat diet would have to be at least 30% fat, right? So anyway, that's what they were looking at, and basically there were lower testosterone levels associated with fat restriction, right? So you can dig into the nitty-gritty details, but that's really the main headline, and people were quite interested in that. And so when you look at the raw values in the studies from this meta-analysis, generally speaking, you're looking at drops of like maybe 50 to 100 nanograms per deciliter when shifting from this higher fat diet up around maybe 40% of fat, going down to a lower fat diet around maybe 20 or so. And it is worth noting there was a similar meta-analysis in females looking at estrogen, which also indicated, when you start getting below maybe 20% of fat from the diet, we do see a modest reduction in sex hormone levels. So a lot of folks saw this and they said, okay, low-fat diets tank your testosterone levels. They went right past the actual magnitude, which is pretty modest in general. And so the kind of primary messaging that you saw around this was like, hey, this is clearly a win for low-carb, high-fat diets, right? And so you throw that into the milieu in the fitness world of people being really stoked about keto, being really stoked about carnivore, talking about how these are just inherently good for your system and body and et cetera. And so people were like, yeah, oh, okay, yeah, that's why I feel so alpha and dominant on my, high-fat diet. So that's fine, but the problem is Whitaker, same author, 1 year later, with some other co-authors, did another meta-analysis, and this one was called Low Carbohydrate Diets and Men's Cortisol and Testosterone, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And so same general idea here, comparing lower carbs to higher carbs. So low carb in this case had to be less than or equal to 35% of calories coming from carbs. And then the gap there had to be at least 20%, right? So if you had a 25% low carb diet, the high carb comparison diet had to be at least 45% carbs, right? So same general idea here. And I should mention in both of these studies, they tried to find folks that, in both of the diets, they were basically similar caloric intake. So it wasn't like cutting versus bulking or anything like that. Similar caloric intake, pretty neutral energy balance, right around maintenance calories. So in this case, 27 studies actually made the cut. So this time, 309 participants were in the mix. And what they found was basically if you go really low with your carbohydrate, it's associated with lower testosterone levels. And so initially people were not stoked about that, right? Because for about 1 year, they had their time in the sun and they were saying, I told you, high fat, low carb, your testosterone is going to be through the roof. And then this meta-analysis says, well, actually, if you restrict your carbs a little too much, and we're not talking about like 5% carb diets, less than 35%, this basically found, that's also associated with lower testosterone. Now, there was a glimmer of hope, Omar. We all love a glimmer of hope, right? So they basically, in this one, they said, I think this was the one where they indicated, no, I need to jump ahead, I think. Yeah, I need to jump ahead to, no, sorry. I'm getting all twisted around here. Basically, in this study, the glimmer of hope was folks were saying like, well, it's only in the, I think the high protein, low carb diets where this was actually, where there was a significant negative relationship with testosterone, right? So they said, okay, so you don't want to go low carb with really high protein, but if you go, that one's bad. But if you go low carb with moderate protein, you're in the clear, like you're totally fine. So the problem with that though, is that when you like look really deeply into the studies that had, high protein, low carbohydrate, they were all kind of like flukes. They were all kind of weird. So, like, if you dig into it, there was only 3 of them, and it was all kind of fluky. So, like, yeah, it basically, a lot of folks were saying that there was all sorts of mixed messaging about this, right? But the general point is that the low carb diets were associated with lower testosterone. It looked like maybe there was a glimmer of hope where, protein might have this big moderating effect. When you look at the details of those protein studies, though, it looks like it's pretty much low carb diets associated with lower testosterone. So basically, there are these 2 meta-analyses. One said, low fat diets, low testosterone. The other said low carb diets, low testosterone. And then there's another meta-analysis by Smith and colleagues. So this one was by a different group of researchers. And they were looking at the effects of caloric restriction in general on testosterone concentrations. So what they found in this one was kind of not a surprise, which is that if you restrict your calories in general really aggressively, you're going to see a drop in testosterone. And that makes a lot of sense because, when you are dropping calories, you have lower energy availability, the hypothalamus senses that, and sex hormones, including testosterone, they're all going to originate up in the hypothalamus, right? So it's, the hypothalamus down to the pituitary, down to the gonads, and that's where testosterone is produced and released. So if the hypothalamus up at the top is getting the signal of low energy availability, it kind of just downregulates the entire system all the way from the top. So basically, when you look at this collection of meta-analyses, initially people were kind of playing tug of war, saying like, my diet looks great. No, my diet looks great. At the end of the day, it looks like if you really wanted to structure a diet in terms of macronutrient composition, energy intake, there doesn't really seem to be much of a cheat code, right? You can't. It looks like the best route is not necessarily at the extremes. It's not some kind of wacky macronutrient distribution where you're going super extreme with carbs or super extreme with fat. It looks like moderation is kind of the best path forward there. So, moderate macronutrient distribution, enough calories to get the job done and basically fuel your body and have adequate energy availability. In terms of macros and calories, that's kind of the beginning and end of the story in terms of trying to do your best to support sex hormone production. So there's no one weird trick there. It's just, your body's going to need carbs and fat and enough energy, to kind of work in its kind of, basic state that it likes to be in. But the other thing I'd mention, though, the kind of final thing I'll mention here before we jump into some follow-up questions. Like I said earlier, the magnitude matters a lot. So the amount of testosterone fluctuation that we're seeing associated with, excessive fat restriction or excessive carb restriction, not really a huge magnitude. Now, with energy restriction, if you want to get your testosterone low, you can get it low, right?
Yeah.
But that's usually going to take some time because it's going to be the convergence of a huge deficit plus really low body fat. That's where we start to see really big reductions in testosterone levels. But all this stuff with macronutrients, if someone told me that they were going to be on a diet that was, 15% fat, I'd say, okay, probably not going to optimize your testosterone, but like not that big a deal, right? I was on, a few weeks or months ago.
Yep.
We talked about how much fat do you really need? And I was like, well, if you want to optimize testosterone, I mean, you probably are going to want to be at least, bare minimum 40, 50, 60 grams a day, right? But that doesn't mean it's going to tank if you go a little bit below that. So, yeah, I mean, those little differences, whether you're going on kind of a low-fat diet like that, or if you're going on a ketogenic diet, there are some studies indicating that testosterone drops a little bit on a ketogenic diet, but it's not a large drop, okay? So, in terms of, the magnitude of that change, you're probably not going to feel it in terms of things like libido, energy level, vitality. You're definitely not going to see it in terms of muscle mass, strength, performance. You need to have a pretty big change to really move the needle there.
Rex, there's so much to unpack here, man. And I like how you framed it concerning the magnitude really being the focus. The one main takeaway that I had here is that big protein is taking the biggest L we've seen because we saw, okay, below a certain threshold, fat intake, below a certain threshold, carbohydrate intake. Well, okay, if we add those two together, where does that leave us when it comes to protein? And this whole time, Trex, you've had these exercise scientists extolling the virtues of having a higher protein intake, but did you know it's damaging your kidneys and low-key trying to kill you over time? Like, come on. The evidence is quite clear.
Yeah, you hate to see that.
Yeah.
And I stumbled aggressively over my words when talking about the moderate versus high protein distinction.
Yep.
I found the excerpt that I was looking for. Never try to talk and read, Omar. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous game. Okay, so when protein intake, we're talking about that low carb meta-analysis, the one that said lower carbs lead to, drops in testosterone. When protein intake was moderate, which was 10 studies, the findings were non-significant. So they're okay, it doesn't really alter testosterone that much. However, when protein intake was high, there was a large, statistically significant drop in testosterone. So I think I got the directionality right. I just yammered on and stumbled over it. So that's good. Brain is working now and firing on all cylinders. You got me in here Friday night, 8 p.m. Omar, I have a real job, okay? I'm in the lab doing science all day. I'm writing code. You know what it's like to write code all day and then try to come be on a podcast? I mean, it melts your brain. You just can't think. Anyway, those 3 studies, right? So there were 10 studies in the, the kind of moderate protein range where they were like, oh, okay, there's a small drop, but it's not quite significant, but, maybe we're thinking about. But the high protein category, that was where they were like, oh, wow, this is like a big effect. And like, testosterone is tanking here. And there were only 3 studies there. And I was like, that's really not a lot of studies, which means that you probably shouldn't have a ton of confidence in that unless you dig a little bit deeper and see what was going on in those 3 studies. Why is this effect size so large? Because it was pretty substantial. So I looked into that and I was like, if that effect size is like a generalizable truth, it actually does put us in that range where I'd say that this actually is more like a physiologically relevant and meaningful drop in testosterone potentially. So I did my due diligence back when I was reading the study a couple years ago and dug into it. And so like in one of the studies, there was this massive difference in baseline testosterone levels between the 2 different intervention diets. And so like the data was just kind of wacky from the start where you're just like, just the baseline difference from one intervention to the next was like essentially as big as the drop that was associated with the low carb intervention, right? So there was they were all over the place, even at baseline, which anytime you see that, it just kind of gives you a little bit of pause when you're interpreting that study. The other one, the intervention was only 3 days long, which very, very, very brief, right? You don't really want to make too many inferences about a 3-day study in terms of how your endocrine system is going to react and adjust. And then the diet, the low carb diet really wasn't, I don't think it was particularly indicative of anything that people really like to do. So it was a 5% carbohydrate diet, right? So we're talking what you would expect with even a pretty aggressive keto approach, right? Even a lot of folks on keto will be up closer to 10% sometimes, and whether or not they count fiber, that's a whole different can of worms. But it was only a 50% fat diet. So it was 5% carbs, 45% protein, and 50% fat. A lot of folks on keto, their fat's up in the 70, 80% range. So that diet, was only a 3-day study, and the diet wasn't super indicative of how people usually do a low-carb diet. And then in the 3rd study, data were only available for 7 participants, and the intervention was only 10 days long, and there was one huge outlier. So when you only have 7 participants and you have an outlier, that means the average within that group is getting pulled way out of bounds, right? And so I think I did some calculations back when I reviewed this for mass, and I found if you just remove that one participant from that study, the effect size was reduced by roughly 1/3. So basically, this huge discrepancy that seemed to be present when you're looking at low carb with moderate protein versus low carb with high protein, In my opinion, probably more of an artifact of the fact that you have 3 very odd studies that all happen to be the only ones in this high protein category. So my main takeaway from it was, you know what? Yeah, if you do extreme carbohydrate restriction, it probably will, have the potential to reduce testosterone a little bit, but the effect size is probably more like what we're seeing in that moderate protein group in most cases, where, the effect size was, this was a standardized mean difference, so like a Cohen's d value, negative 0.3. Okay, that's something. Testosterone wasn't tanking, but it kind of puts it more on par with, severe fat restriction, where we're saying, okay, if we're doing, fat restriction, carb restriction, whichever way we're going there, we might see it moving enough that is detectable, measurable change in testosterone, but probably not something that's fundamentally altering our physiological state.
Folks, you heard it here first. Big Protein just got a Trex. He was going along, just relaying the information, said, oh, wait, that's not how it went. Let me, what's this new line said? Let me take a look at that. And wow, here we go. Another victim of Big Protein. I will say a few things. It is interesting to see when, let's say, a meta-analysis comes out, or the first one showing, dips in fat intake, and then, how it may or may not influence testosterone, where it's almost one of the most interesting aspects of the industry is to see the misinterpretation. So the interaction between, a study being published, how it's misinterpreted, then how it's disseminated into the community, and then how like people will spend a year or several years, or sometimes like jokingly before what I said about protein and its role in terms of your kidneys, decades fighting against, and why having, crystal clear or as clear as possible communication regarding these things is very important. First. Second, Trex, I do want to apologize for having you Friday in the evening. Your boy just woke up an hour ago. The last time I did programming was grade 11 with Pascal, the language. Okay, that's the
you just woke up.
No, unfortunately, I wish I could portray myself as that. I woke up. It was 10:30 a.m. Okay, we're resetting.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's fine. Hey, I'm not here to judge anyone for their sleep-wake cycle. You know, when they go to bed, when they wake up. If you're getting hopefully a good 6 to 8 hours, you're good with me.
Hey, and to that point, I think jumping then ahead, I think what's so interesting about this overview, Trex, you just covered, so jumping ahead a little bit, where you said about, okay, so if you're in a caloric restriction and you're losing weight, its role, the caloric restriction in terms of your testosterone, the hypothalamus, what's going on there. I do want to circle back to leptin, which is later on in your article. But let's then maybe contrast that, because this is interesting. Okay, so we observe a caloric restriction leading to a decrease in testosterone. But then, on the other hand, we have then folks that have a higher BMI attempting to lose weight. And then what happens to their testosterone on the other side of the coin?
Yeah, so this is tricky. The relationship between, I'll just say adiposity and testosterone, right? So adiposity just refers to kind of the relative amount of fat mass an individual has. And it's kind of an easier kind of catch-all term, because some studies you'll be looking at body fat percentage, others you'll be looking at fat mass, others you'll be looking at BMI. Easier to just kind of say adiposity. So with adiposity, what we generally find is when you are going from relatively high adiposity to moderate adiposity, right? So if we were to put numbers on this for an example, let's say a male individual cutting from, 35% body fat to 15% body fat, or 18% body fat, something around there. In that scenario, we would likely see that the individual experiences an increase in testosterone. Now, a lot of folks in the fitness world think when you're dieting, testosterone tanks. Not always the case. In the fitness world, when we think about dieting, we're thinking about usually trying to get shredded, right? But what happens is there's a lot of conversion in adipose tissue of testosterone and other androgens to various forms of estrogen, right? And so sometimes, very frequently, in individuals, in males with a high level of adiposity, we'll see relatively higher circulating levels of different estrogens and relatively lower circulating levels of testosterone and other androgens, right? And so that's purely a direct mechanism linked to the amount of fat mass that you carry. And so it is common for people with relatively high body fat to experience symptomatic low testosterone, like clinically relevant low testosterone. And one of the ways those individuals can get their testosterone back into kind of the reference range would be by losing some body fat and getting back to a level of adiposity that's more conducive to optimizing testosterone levels. But this is one of those things that it's fantastic in science and physiology when you have these like really simple relationships. One goes up, the other goes up, one goes up, the other goes down. That's always ideal, but in this case, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not linear. So going from very high adiposity to moderate adiposity, you're likely to see a rise in testosterone levels. But when you are going from kind of moderate adiposity to very low adiposity, very shredded, virtually always you're going to see a pretty significant drop in testosterone. And in this case, we're not talking about 50 nanograms per deciliter, right? And just to contextualize that, I don't know if I mentioned this, but reference range for testosterone for a young, healthy male, often going to be in the ballpark of, 300 at the low end. At the high end, it varies. You'll see different charts in different places, but usually up around 1,000, 1,200. That's where you're going to see the upper end of the reference range. When you see someone getting ready for a bodybuilding show, it's not at all unusual to see somebody drop from 600 nanograms per deciliter to 130. I mean, it is a massive drop. A lot of times you're not even within reach of the bottom end of the reference range when you're ready to get on stage. And so, dropping from 600 to 550, you're not going to feel it. It's not going to affect body composition, it's not going to affect really anything. But dropping from 600 to 130, you're going to feel that, right? So, the first time I got really lean for a competition, I went to my doctor just to kind of see what my numbers looked like, because you could just feel it. If you've never felt it,
what are the symptoms,
unique.
Trex?
When you have low testosterone, I mean, super lethargic, no energy. You feel certainly low libido, and then you just kind of lose your edge a little bit. Like testosterone, it really does kind of change the way that, like, it just kind of twists the dials a little bit on your general temperament. It really does. And you just kind of, if you're used to living with, relatively higher testosterone levels, and then they tank all of a sudden, you kind of just feel like a shell of yourself. Like it's really not a fun way to go about your business. And so there's no mistaking when you have like really significantly reduced testosterone, like it's very apparent. So when I went into the doctor, I was not thinking, oh, I wonder if I maybe have low testosterone. I was thinking, I just want to know what number this feels like, because I know I have low testosterone right now, and I know it's temporary. It's part of getting ready for a natural bodybuilding show. In a lot of cases, it's not what you aim for, but it's usually what happens. So I go in there and it was low. I mean, I know for sure it was under 200. I think it might have even been under 150. I mean, it was very, very low. And so, yeah, it's an unmistakable feeling, but all of that is to say, if you're trying to optimize your testosterone levels, like we said with the macronutrients, the optimal approach, I guess, based on the evidence, would be to have a fairly moderate macronutrient distribution. Maybe fat makes up, 25, 30% of your diet, something like that. If you're on really high calories, you can probably drop that down to 20 if you want to be in the like fully optimal range. You got plenty of protein, and then you've got plenty of carbs coming in on top of that. But yeah, that's kind of like the optimal way to go with your macronutrient distribution. But at the end of the day, it's like I said, the magnitude is just tiny. You're not going to see a precipitous drop if you go from 25% fat to 20 or 15, So So a lot of people spend a lot of time focusing on that when they talk about testosterone, but that's really not moving the needle to a meaningful degree. But yeah, going from excess adiposity to moderate adiposity can make a meaningful change in the positive direction, like a clinically relevant increase. And then, if you are really slashing your calories and getting leaner, and especially if you're already shredded, that's the scenario where low calories combined with really low body fat, you're probably going to see testosterone absolutely tank. And it's temporary in most cases. You can, once you kind of get done with that phase of your diet, you get back to a more sustainable body fat level, your calories come back up. In that case, testosterone will usually recover. But yeah, the macronutrient stuff is minor, but adiposity it has an absolutely enormous role. And so sometimes we'll I'll admit I had hopes early in my bodybuilding career, like, well, if I'm really shredded, but like maybe if I have enough fat in my diet, I won't experience that drop in testosterone. It did not matter at all. Body fat is such a powerful, has such a powerful impact in this particular outcome that you can't really macro your way through and think that you're going to be 5% body fat and not experience a drop in testosterone. So yeah, unfortunately, the macros aren't really moving the needle too much.
Trex, I'm sorry to hear about that experience with low testosterone. I'm going to go off script here, though, because I do think this area is very interesting. What determines then at what point should one expect this drop in testosterone as one attempts to get leaner? I assume there'd be several different factors. So, like how low you have to go in your calories, so your overall energy availability being one of the large determinants. Maybe another one, so let's say like overall genetic predisposition, so how tough it is for one to lose weight, the amount that's necessary to be lean, and then maybe what another one would be like your experience doing it. I assume like your first time in particular. Again, we're about to discuss how lean we're talking exactly. But I assume even if you try to do everything right, like your body almost has to adapt that each subsequent time it's probably going to dip down, but maybe not as much. Like what is this? Just frame it for people such as myself, because in 2024, your boy's bulking right now. I want to get lean to that, that lucrative, let's call it 9% Trex, maybe 8%. Like, at what point do people start noticing this significant drop in testosterone, and what are some of the factors? And then we'll get back to, because there's actually some very interesting questions that's about leptin and also the muscle building potential of people with higher levels of adiposity. But yeah, just talk to me about this, man.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not an area that's particularly well studied. There's not a lot of departments over at the National Institute of Health where they're like, we need to know now when when you go from fitness model to on-stage bodybuilder, at what point does testosterone start to tank? It's just not a major public health concern, which means it doesn't get a lot of attention in the literature, the scientific research. But, anecdotally, it's certainly not linear, not at all, right? So, usually if you're starting a contest prep, I've always told people the first half of prep is usually a breeze for me. Like if I'm going to end up cutting about 40 pounds prepping for a show, first 20, no big deal. As you're going from 16 to 14 to 12, that's smooth sailing. I don't like measure my testosterone regularly throughout, but I don't really notice much at all. But there does seem to be a very non-linear relationship, and there seems to be a bit of an inflection point where once you get below a certain body fat level, now the slope really starts to accelerate, meaning, every bit leaner you get, you start to really notice that fairly precipitous drop in testosterone level. Now, where that number is, certainly there's going to be variation from person to person. What's dictating that variation? It's really hard to say. I think certainly there's got to be some degree of heritability to that, meaning you're just kind of born with a particular threshold that, may be higher for me than it is for you, or vice versa. I expect that heritability is dictating some of that difference. And when I say heritability, that's what in the fitness world we just say genetics, right? I don't know if I've ever seen any literature pertaining to the idea that maybe it's not as bad the next time around, the second, the third, the fourth time. I will say for me personally, going fully off of anecdote, the first time I prepped for bodybuilding, I didn't experience it because I didn't get lean enough, which is pretty common. The second time I did a series of shows, I got legitimately lean for the first time, and it was terrible. And then the next time around, I reached a similar level of body fat, maybe even a little bit leaner. And I definitely experienced a precipitous drop in testosterone. I didn't get it measured because what's the point, right? I was like, hey, I know how this feels. I've been here before, and I know it'll come back later. I don't think that physiologically it was easier the second time around, but I do think mentally, psychologically, it was a lot easier the second time around because you've been there before. You're not. It's weird the amount of anxiety that comes from not really knowing what to expect the first time you really get that lean. And I know it sounds really silly and perhaps even kind of dumb, but I'll tell coaches all the time, like, it's very important to just tell folks what to expect and tell them all the weird, not normal things that they should view as normal. Because bodybuilding is really weird. It's weird on your way down to getting super shredded, and it's weird on your way back up after you've been shredded. So there's a lot of crazy physiology stuff that happens. And I think in many ways, the most, the most challenging thing about that is just the confusion that you experience, or the uncertainty or the anxiety that arises from going through these big changes and saying, so am I going to feel this way for 2 years, or is it going to be for like 2 months? Are we sure it's going to come back when we start, eating more and getting back to a more typical body fat level? And then a lot of people have a lot of worries after they get shredded where they're like, well, how am I going to sustain this? This doesn't seem doable. And then as they start regaining weight, they start to think, okay, I just gained 3 pounds in a week. And if I extrapolate that over, the next 50 weeks, I'm going to gain 150 pounds, right? Like there's all sorts of, it's a really challenging spot to be in if you don't know what to expect and you don't know where the road leads. So I've never seen evidence, it could exist, but I've never seen evidence to suggest that physiologically it gets any easier to get to those really low body fat levels, or that you experience fewer of those, what we might call side effects or adaptations. But I do know just from a psychological perspective, it becomes much more tolerable.
Let me just strike that I'm going to share an anecdote here, how bedside manner can count for a lot, or as a coach, just sharing with them either personal experience or the expectations of the weird things you could that can happen to you. So when I first got glasses, I'm wearing glasses right now. You're wearing glasses. I saw my optometrist. Had my prescription for a distance. Next year went down by -50. Okay, then the year after that, same idea, -50, so 0.5 down. And just extrapolating it forward, I asked my optometrist as a teenager. I said, if this trend continues, I'm like, but in 10 years or whatever, I'll be legally blind. And he said, yeah, we'll have to see. And that was his answer. And it said the normal things, like it will level off, and that's exactly what happened. But just in terms of coaching someone, like here are some of the things that you can expect. And I do think you're absolutely right. That's a very good point about, your subjective experience can change. Physiologically, some of the similar things are occurring. And let me put some respect on our co-host, Helm's his name, who I know this prep for himself, he's been just talking with me, that I could tell the mental exertion to get to a certain point has been decidedly lower, and he's looking better. Now, if we're to measure to your point, his testosterone, he probably, you've competed several times, he's competed many times, that it's probably not that your testosterone isn't dipping, it's that you know what to expect, and it's happening at a certain point, and you can embrace it, and it's almost that unknown. And I can only assume, too, where your behavior, Trex, correct me if I'm wrong, not that it'd be erratic, but because you're in an emotional state of vulnerability, this is something you haven't done before, you haven't felt this way, it feels abnormal to you, your living state that's occurring, that many of those questions are very sensible, how long am I going to feel like this? Or when am I going to start feeling normal, in quotations, or the fat gain? Let's say, so yeah, you're on a rebound, and it's well, if I keep doing this way, like, this will happen. So very valid what you said.
Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of extreme, but there's a really fascinating paper that was written not too long ago, actually, but it was kind of reflecting on the Minnesota starvation experiment, which when it comes to getting very, very lean, it's one of those studies where we derive a lot of what we know, because there aren't that many large cohorts of people who are pushed to that level of leanness. But Minnesota starvation experiment was a group of conscientious objectors who were instead of doing military service, were put into this study, and they got very, very lean, and they did a lot of physical activity. It was a semi-starvation study, so there was significant food restriction on top of that physical activity, and folks got very, very lean as a person would ever want to get. And it's kind of our first glimpse. I would say this is where metabolic adaptation research really began in a meaningful way. But there's a interesting paper that just kind of reflected on the psychological sides of that, because the Minnesota starvation study is published as not just like a little paper in a journal. It's a 2-volume book. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, which I think is appropriate. For everything that the participants put into that study, you better have volumes of observations and make every bit of use out of that study, because the participant burden for that study was just, out of this world, just through the roof. So anyway, some of the psychological responses to being in that state and kind of feeling kind of stuck in that state, there was all sorts of stuff where, they just weren't really behaving like themselves. There were instances where people, you can check out the paper and see all the particular anecdotes, but I've seen kind of similar things happening I've heard of similar things happening in physique athletes, of just things like hoarding kitchen supplies, like things where you're just like, it doesn't really make sense. This is a stressful time, and people are just kind of not quite themselves when they're in that like really lean state, and they're still calorically restricted, and they very much want to eat more. Like, in the Minnesota starvation experiment, like there was some serious psychological, basically episodes where people just were not themselves.
Yeah.
And so, it can be a really stressful thing. And, from a evolutionary perspective, it ought to be a pretty stressful thing. That's one of the most dire stressors that the human body can really experience, is to be that close to not having enough energy to get by. It would make sense that there are some pretty extreme reactions to trying to maintain that state. So it's unfortunate. And, normally in physique sport, it doesn't get to that level. It's just people get a little bit more food focused, and some of their behaviors adapt accordingly. But yeah, going into an endeavor like that, you certainly want to have some understanding of what's coming, so that you can kind of not be super stressed and anxious about it, and have some of those anxiety-based behavioral responses.
Trex, excellent segment. Let's hop back then to this discussion on testosterone. Let's hop on testosterone here, because there's something interesting. Okay, so it was noted with higher levels of adiposity, as people began to lose weight, that their testosterone would go up due to the role, as you said, of fat having this excess fat, the conversion of testosterone into estrogen, or not quite estrogen. But Trex, if that occurs, and we're noting for another reason then, where you said the directionality of things, why isn't this one of the factors when people get leaner? So there's many different things at play. So the hypothalamus, but then if we're losing all this extra fat, and fat holds on, or it'll convert it past a certain amount, testosterone into estrogen. Why is this not countering it? Or what are some of the other factors here when people attempt to get leaner, where it seems like overall higher adiposity, as one begins to lose weight to a certain extent, it is actually positive, its influence on testosterone? What is that factor when it comes to getting leaner? We know overall that once testosterone goes down, but what's going on there?
Well, so leptin is interesting as it pertains to testosterone, right? So normally, like for example, when someone's getting shredded, right? They're getting really, really lean. Leptin is going down and down and down because fat cells are shrinking. And so when there's low leptin, that feeds into the hypothalamus, relays that message that there's low energy available, generally speaking. And we see all those hypothalamic hormone cascades start to get downregulated. So we see reductions in things like thyroid hormone, which originates, up in the hypothalamus, then pituitary, then thyroid hormone, or thyroid gland, I should say. But there's these multi-structure cascades, and testosterone is one of them, hypothalamus to pituitary to gonads. And so low leptin, we would think that's a scenario where, okay, yeah, we expect testosterone to go down. And then the flip side is when leptin is high, we would think that testosterone would be high, right? But then people get to the state of, let's say we kind of take it in order, right? So you start super shredded, leptin's low, testosterone's low. And then you go to kind of a, intermediate, kind of moderate adiposity level. At that point, leptin is going up again and testosterone's going up again, and both maybe are in their like pretty typical ranges. Well, when you start going, when you start gaining even more weight from there and adiposity gets into an even higher level, so kind of excess adiposity, we get to a situation where, like I said, with testosterone, we're going to see more of that conversion into various forms of estrogen, and leptin's not really doing what we would expect it to because people develop what we call leptin resistance in the instance of excess adiposity. So basically, there is plenty of leptin in circulation, but the actual leptin receptors are not adequately sensitive. They're not really, the cellular response to that leptin in circulation is not as pronounced. And so we see where this relationship that we might observe between testosterone and leptin at lower body fat ranges, it starts to kind of disassociate at higher body fat or higher adiposity levels. And it's because of those two simultaneous things happening. So testosterone getting converted to estrogens due to, in the fat cell, because of that excess adiposity, and then resistance to the leptin that's circulating. So you would think, we think of leptin and metabolic adaptation. If someone who's, really lean and experiencing a great deal of metabolic adaptation, leptin is super low. If you inject exogenous leptin, you will reverse just about everything associated with metabolic adaptation. And it's been done, not often, but there are studies showing that. Like, yeah, it really is a leptin problem. However, that is in a person who is extremely leptin sensitive. The problem is once body fat is elevated for, a chronic period of time, persistent period of time, we start to see that the cellular response to leptin just kind of starts to degrade, not super dissimilar to what we see with insulin resistance, right? So like we think, insulin causes blood sugar to go back into cells. Someone who has excess adiposity and high circulating insulin, they should have no problem with blood sugar. The problem is that the cells are not responding to insulin the way that they used to. So that normal regulation becomes decoupled. So hopefully, I think that probably answers the question you were alluding to, which is how do we explain, that relationship and where it appears to break down?
Absolutely. No, I think Trex, there's a few things in this article that are very interesting. So one being those with higher adiposity, and then how losing it will influence then testosterone. Another, though, if we want to go to this part now, a myth that I thought for a long period of time, and maybe has to do with like either P ratios or like what people would have assumed, and that is that having higher levels of adiposity would be a negative environment for either building muscle or other such factors due to a wide variety of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic that like, it's very intuitive to think that, right? You'd think, okay, well, excess adiposity, you're thinking maybe testosterone's lower, you're thinking there's all sorts of inflammation going on, maybe lower insulin sensitivity, right? So there's been a lot of theories that excess adiposity should blunt hypertrophy to some extent. And to what extent, it kind of depends who you ask, right? People will kind of speculate about that. And I'm definitely sympathetic to the fact that those mechanisms sound logical. They sound intuitive. One could say they even sound appealing, like, oh, yeah, that's a nice cohesive story, feels good. But when you look at the empirical data, it just doesn't seem to work that way. I wrote an article about this for Mass, and then followed up with a whole series of additional articles. And, it ranged from looking at all these different studies and eventually doing a participant level meta-analysis, which is where, sometimes researchers will publish, it's fantastic when they do, they'll publish their entire raw data set that anyone can go and download from the internet to see the actual individual raw data from their study. And so I did that and kind of gathered up all the data points and did a meta-analysis instead of looking at group averages, looking at the actual raw individual data from all these different studies. And the idea was to look at okay, at what point does excess adiposity start to actually interfere with hypertrophy in response to resistance training programs? We just never found the place where it interferes. Now that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it does mean that we saw a pretty broad range of adiposity levels, and we didn't detect anything of the sort. And so what it looked like was, if you were to compare in our participant level meta-analysis, if you were to compare leaner individuals to individuals with higher adiposity and say, who has more potential for hypertrophy, it was equivalent. The growth was pretty much similar across the board. The main distinction was individuals with higher body fat had a much greater propensity to simultaneously lose fat while achieving that same level of hypertrophy. And that could be two things. It could be, number one, you have more fat to lose, and, pretty simple, you start engaging in resistance training behavior and some weight loss occurs, right? Another possibility is there could have been sometimes you'll see instances where a resistance training study that's designed specifically for individuals who are untrained or potentially, have high adiposity at baseline, it might be designed in a way that's a little bit more conducive to inducing some degree of fat loss. So there could be multiple things going into that, but I've looked at that question empirically from a number of different angles, and it's like, a lot of the most muscular athletes on the planet happen to have high body fat levels. When we look at, collegiate American football teams where you have super lean people and people with very high adiposity, they don't really seem to experience dramatically different gains in their off-season training programs. Fat-free mass, if you want to see a lot of it, go talk to a sumo wrestler. You're going to see plenty. Highest in the world based on the measurements I've seen. And so, you look at it from a lot of different angles. And then I think the strongest evidence by far is looking at a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And we're just not seeing that relationship really panning out. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact, personally, that number one, we can talk about all these different, small reductions in testosterone, and you have to change testosterone. You have to move the needle a lot if you want to actually impact hypertrophy. If you're moving it by 50, 100 nanograms per deciliter, it's probably not going to do much at all in terms of your hypertrophy potential. You need to really, you need to have that situation like a bodybuilding prep where you're going from 600 to 150, or you're on anabolics and you're just off the charts, right? That's where we start to see meaningful, large changes in body composition. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, when it comes to hypertrophy, energy availability is a huge deal, right? Yes. And so someone who's shredded and maybe in a caloric deficit, we all intuitively know it's going to be hard for them to build muscle. I don't particularly care where their testosterone level is if they're natural. We know that's an uphill battle because building new muscle requires a lot of energy. It's an energy-intensive process. And so if you're shredded, you don't have a lot of long-term energy stored. If you're in a deficit, you don't have a lot of short-term energy available. Your body's probably not going to say, hey, you know what we should do? Build an unnecessary amount of muscle and burn a bunch of energy to do it, right? Now, when we look at someone who has higher body fat, those constraints are not the same, right? I mean, there's a great deal of stored energy. And so it kind of makes sense that we wouldn't see a major constraint on the ability to engage in a relatively energy-intensive physiological process. So the other thing is resistance training, as you become more and more engaged in it, it directly opposes the other two mechanisms that people often point to with this P ratio idea, this idea that having excess fat will blunt your ability to build muscle. So what I mean by that is people say, well, if you have excess body fat, you're going to have, really impaired insulin sensitivity, and you're also going to have a bunch of chronic inflammation. But when someone with high adiposity engages in resistance training and kind of adopts that program and sticks with it for several weeks, what we see during that initial phase of getting into resistance training is their insulin sensitivity improves and their baseline kind of chronic inflammation levels go down. And so resistance training is directly countering those two of those mechanisms. And so when you look at those mechanisms on paper, initially they seem to be kind of compelling. But then when you try to actually get someone to defend that stance and say, where's the evidence to suggest this? I've asked a lot of people to kind of like, please bring me that evidence if it's out there. And usually they bring studies that are in elderly individuals who are very sick. And they say, see, this shows that inflammation blunts hypertrophy, therefore high adiposity blunts hypertrophy. I've never had someone bring me a study that said these individuals struggled to build muscle because their body fat was high. It's always, look at these hospitalized individuals, or look at these individuals in their late 80s. It's never body fat. But like, Omar, we studied what happens when people with high body fat lift weights. If this phenomenon exists and is pertinent and is prevalent out there, we should have documentation of it. And no one's ever shown that to me. But I've seen quite a bit to suggest the opposite.
Trex, that's actually very, very reassuring for a lot of individuals that want to, endeavor to start lifting and they're worried about various things. I remember I still believed in the general concept because it sounded, in quotations, true. I would say up until like a decade ago, 2014, 2015, so it was not long ago whatsoever. And I think from a general, like anecdotal level, like lifters would talk amongst themselves that, like you gain a lot of weight first superficially, you can't see due to the increase in body fat level, the muscle that's being built, the appreciable amount potentially, but also because sometimes I think there'd be rapid fluctuations amongst lifters. So they'd gain a lot of weight, they'd try to lose a lot of weight. And that process of attempting to lose said weight would come with it, maybe at the cost of losing some muscle just due to the pathway that they followed, the protocol. And so then they would associate, like I gained a lot of weight, I gained a lot of fat, I attempted to lose it to see the new hard-earned muscle. And somewhere along that process, it was fudged. The net result is that I didn't experience the same gain. Therefore, and that, the myth kind of gets perpetuated. And then on a second level, man, I'll say recently, so shout out to Dr. Pack, where I had it's going to be in an upcoming video where it basically was a video all in defense of bear mode. So bear mode, it's like the term is like getting a little huskier to try and accumulate weight. And he went into the whole thing about either as long as you have a higher energy availability, the concept that you can build muscle around maintenance or at a higher level of body fat than many people would assume. Then he went into like what is health, like how do we define health, what are healthy levels of body fat. And in the industry, I would say that our perception of what is a healthy level of body fat is that 12%, right? Rather than like an 18% body fat. And I think there's that extra pressure to look a certain way to conform to societal expectations that kind of just, once again, perpetuates that myth. So I like, shout out to mass multi-application and strength, like just you adding that at the end, because I think that's another reassuring part for people that are potentially interested in pursuing either lifting weight or it doesn't really matter. But something that I would say, if myself, who I've been reading a lot of different publications for years and years, up until like 8-9 years ago, thought this was true, it's pretty prevalent, therefore.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of note that when you start arguing in the defense of, you don't need to be lean to build muscle, you can build plenty of muscle when body fat is high, and when body fat's high, that kind of long-term signal of energy availability is present. Sometimes people conflate that with a recommendation to go forth and dreamer bulk, and that's not what I'm doing. So what we have, if you want to do that, by all means, I did it once. It was glorious. But that's not necessary, nor is it necessarily the best way to do it. Our dear friend Dr. Helms has they published a preprint where they were looking at, how big does a caloric surplus need to be to facilitate hypertrophy. And, their study happened during COVID. There was all sorts of challenges associated with that, but I think they did a really great job presenting their data, relating it to other data on the topic. And it doesn't really look like, in most cases, a caloric surplus needs to be huge in order to fuel muscle growth. I mean, you want to be you want to have plenty of energy around. You don't want to be shredded and in a deficit and trying to build muscle. It's not going to be great. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to dream or bulk, right? And so I think along the lines of what you're saying from Dr. Pack, I would suggest that the need for a caloric surplus and the appropriate magnitude for a surplus probably does depend a lot on your body fat level. So like you were saying, if you have a little bit of extra body fat, nothing wrong with that. And it probably means that you can likely build muscle even at maintenance or in just a razor thin caloric surplus. And of course, training status matters a lot, right? So if you're untrained, you can build muscle in a lot of different conditions. But even if you're pretty well trained, if you got some extra body fat, you probably don't need a particularly sizable caloric surplus to nudge things along with hypertrophy. I think being in a surplus and even the magnitude of that surplus gets more important as you get leaner and leaner and leaner. But yeah, so I just want to make sure people don't jump to the conclusion that I'm saying if you want to get big, you must have a great deal of extra body fat. That's not necessarily the case. You just don't want to be shredded. So you were asking, where does that happen when, as you're going down and things are going smooth and then you say, uh-oh, things are getting real. It differs from person to person. I think, like I said, a lot of that's pretty heritable, but in most cases, I think it ends up being, 7 to 9% body fat is where a lot of folks experience that. I know there's plenty of folks who can walk around maybe at 7% body fat and they're like, I'm actually doing pretty fine here. I don't know a lot of folks who can do that below 7, to be honest. So somewhere in that kind of high single digit range is where a lot of folks notice, okay, now things are really taking a turn and, testosterone starts tanking, energy availability is very, very low. Hypertrophy potential is not very high, not necessarily because of the testosterone reduction, but those things are happening in unison.
That notorious 7% influencer body fat, or as Helm says, they're not really 7%. They'll just rattle off. I love how people will rattle off, Trex, their body fat percentage, not verified by anything, or this about say a DEXA, which is a great way to assess when done correctly. But let's just say there's ways of manipulating some of these things to produce a desirable result.
So sinister. Let's just say there's ways.
Yeah.
A very, very sinister way to put that.
Let's just say there's ways.
Yeah, a guy who can help you out. I remember back when I was first getting into lifting, I always said that I was 10% body fat because it was like a value system to me. Like, do I seem like the kind of guy who would be over 10% body fat? Now, this was my immature 18-year-old brain, which had a very unhealthy, very very meatheady approach to body fat percentages, and I was just like, I'm the jacked guy. I'm always under 10% body fat. Maybe when I'm bulking, I'll say I'm 10%. Of course, I was well above 10% at the time, but I had no idea. I didn't like how it sounded, being over 10%. So I can empathize with the influencers, and I bet in 5 or 10 years, Omar, let's be charitable. We're old men, right? Yeah. We can look back at our youth and say, I thought I had it all figured out. In 5 years, all those influencers will say, okay, I'm ready to come clean. In hindsight, I was probably 13% body fat, but yeah, at the time, felt like the right thing to me.
Trexler, they'll say, actually, in hindsight, I was 7.5% body fat. I wasn't 7% body fat, right?
That alone, that kills me. So, Omar, you were in Grant's lab, Grant Tinsley, my nemesis, who I also love, by the way. you were in Grand Slab. The thing that kills me is when people will get online and I'll be like, well, I won't ask them because I don't care. But so they'll advertise like, I am 7.3% body fat. Omar, what does that decimal point mean to you after you went on every different machine and they were all different by like 5 percentage points?
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I feel like the decimal point after that number is to justify what they're saying is true in their head, because they know if it's like 7%, like that sounds outlandish. Like you're right on the dot 7. So it's like 7.3.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like I got this measured.
Yeah.
Now, don't ask me about the validity and reliability of the tool that was used to measure, but this was measured, which means we're going to 7.31% body fat precisely.
Hey, 2 decimal places.
Let's do it. Yeah. Now, Omar, if I can steer the ship here, I don't want to overstep. I know it's only my second episode.
Yep.
I do want to throw one wrinkle in here, right? Yep. So in many cases so far, I've kind of downplayed the likelihood that someone is going to meaningfully shift their testosterone level. There are, like I said, if you're getting absolutely shredded, it's going to drop. If you're at a level of, excess adiposity, the higher that goes, the more likely you are to see kind of a clinically relevant reduction in testosterone. But aside from those scenarios, I've mentioned, going on a little diet, getting kind of lean, not a huge deal, low carb, low fat, might move the needle a little bit, but not enough to really worry about, right? So when we talk about these small fluctuations of, let's say maybe 50, 100 nanograms per deciliter, those are not going to be a game changer in terms of your strength, your performance, your body composition. I would say, unless you're talking about change, you don't even start talking about that stuff in my book until you're moving the needle by 250, 300 nanograms per deciliter. That's where you're going to start to say, because of that change in testosterone, now I'm bigger and stronger, right? So I've kind of downplayed the idea of even doing anything at all to kind of, try to shift your testosterone level. But I don't want to give the impression that there's nothing you can do. And I don't want to give the impression that small changes are always meaningless. So I've been talking about this from the perspective of someone who's interested in getting jacked, building muscle, all that sort of stuff. But, there's a really interesting paper I read a couple years ago where they talked about low testosterone. And you asked me previously, what does it feel like? And that matters, right? We live in our feelings. We experience life through that prism. They're with us every day. And so feeling like crap all the time, or feeling lethargic and, low vitality, low energy, low libido, not a fun way to go throughout your day, not what you'd hope for. And so there is utility in being able to circumvent those types of things. Now, the interesting paper that I read a couple years ago was talking about how the threshold for that, when does your testosterone get so low that you start feeling some of that stuff? And it seems to vary a lot from person to person. And in this paper, they argued basically two things. It varies from person to person, and also it does seem to be kind of a threshold effect. It's not this like perfectly linear thing where as your testosterone goes down by 1 unit, you get increasingly more lethargic. Instead, they kind of talk about it. It's like you get up to this threshold, which kind of differs from person to person. And once you drop below that threshold, then you really start to feel some of those effects. And so what that tells me is there may be utility in trying to do the things you can do in order to, if you are, maybe on the low end of that reference range, or perhaps just a touch below it, and you're thinking, man, if I could boost my testosterone or restore to kind of more typical levels for me, if I could get a change of 50 nanograms per deciliter or 100, maybe I get over that threshold. And maybe, I'm not, building muscle like I'm on anabolics, but maybe I'm just kind of feeling better, higher energy, more vitality, more libido, things like that, because that stuff matters. I do think it's valuable to make that magnitude of change if you're in that very unique situation, which is like, I am just barely over that threshold. I'm just starting to experience these types of symptoms, and I think I'm really within reach of a testosterone level that just feels a lot better for me day to day. And so in that case, there are some things that you can do, right? So there are ways that you can impact that stuff, behavioral things you can do to impact testosterone in that type of magnitude. So if I were in that situation, maybe this macronutrient stuff does start to matter to me. And I say, okay, I am going to shoot for a moderate distribution of macros. Like I said, put my fat at 25, 30% of calories, make sure my protein's not so high that I'm displacing all my carbohydrate, at least be eating at maintenance, maybe even a slight surplus to help things out. Unless my low testosterone is likely driven by excess adiposity. In that case, I'd probably go in a surplus. But the other things we can do, the kind of behavioral things, getting adequate sleep can matter for testosterone, right? And that's a thing that you can, in many cases, actually modulate. That's something that you can influence. Getting regular physical activity. Probably everyone listening to this has that box checked, I would imagine, or most people. But it is worth noting that physical activities, it's not a linear relationship. So if you're doing too little, that could be associated with low testosterone. But also if you're doing too much, that can be associated with low testosterone. And so you want to be in that sweet spot where you're active, but not, really pushing super hard, not being able to recover and experiencing drops in testosterone accordingly. You also probably want to take a look at a few key micronutrients. This is where things start to get a little bit debatable. So zinc, magnesium, you just don't want to be deficient in them. Vitamin D, that's the one where people have a lot of debates about exactly how we untangle the relationship between vitamin D status and testosterone levels. But I would say if you're going to look at 3 micronutrients, magnesium, zinc, and vitamin D, that's where you'd be focused. So if I was experiencing just some of those like little symptoms of low testosterone, my first thing would be make sure I'm at an adiposity level that's conducive to fairly optimal testosterone levels. Then I would make sure my sleep and physical activity are in appropriate ranges. I would take a look at those micronutrients or maybe just supplement with them. I mean, no harm in just taking a basic multivitamin that's got, some zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D in it. You don't need to go crazy with the dosage. And then there are a couple dietary supplements that maybe might increase things a tiny bit, but honestly, those are things that I would only look into after I've tried this other stuff and just kind of see how it goes, So, for example, if you look, there was a review paper about testosterone boosting supplements, and most of the studies that they pointed out, they would show increases in testosterone levels, maybe in the ballpark of like 40, 50, sometimes up to 100 nanograms per deciliter. But to be totally frank, some of the studies are pretty low quality, right? And so I would say I would start with the behavioral stuff, then maybe try some of the more robustly studied supplements that are out there. And then after that, probably chat with a physician and say, okay, maybe time to take a look at this and discuss options there.
Trex, what about oysters though?
What about oysters? Hey man, actually that's quite a question, a big question, because I generally try to eat a vegan diet, and I think oysters are one of the things that people really go. There's a lot of debates about whether or not vegan people can eat oysters. Personally, I don't really like them, so I don't have to worry about that dilemma. But we could do a whole show on what about oysters.
Trex, the one weird trick to restore your testosterone. Let me just say on a small note, and then we'll jump back to wrapping up around testosterone recommendations or circling back to anything, because the word I'm associating with you, Trex, I would say is efficient, because you'll go through a topic, answer basically the vast majority of the questions. That's like perfect. Right on to the next topic then, which is almost uncomfortable. As a co-host, I'm like, man, this guy's, it's like, it's incredibly time. That's why I threw in also just the question about, getting shredded and so forth. One, out of personal curiosity, I think it'd be relevant to the listener. But I can't believe it's been less than 90 minutes and we've covered like basically everything. But I will say that sleep, on a side note, one of the things when I spoke with Helms and I was like, yeah, man, don't want to get back really into lifting, balance, my work-life balance definitely needs to be sorted again. when I'm stressed out, my dietary changes. I'm one of those people where I just don't eat. So I was struggling just to maintain my weight was, just dropping always several pounds. But I'll just say as a side note, I did not experience remotely what you experienced, Trex, about symptoms of like low testosterone. But I downloaded a sleep app. I was not surprised by the result. I downloaded actually a few just to try and verify. I'm like, is this the case? Are they trying to sell me something? Where it's like, you have a low sleep quality. But on average, anyways, it was less than 5 hours per night, which does it like in the context, considering I would actually bring up my headphones into my bed because I'd just be awake like during various periods of nighttime. Like, might as well be listening to some good tunes while I kind of have a little bit of insomnia, but not related quite to testosterone. But let's just say one's ability to either build an appreciable amount of muscle, like training quality, like overall disposition. But I do think in our modern era, just sleep quality being a large factor for so many things is actually underrated.
I would love for us to do a whole episode on sleep because it's something that I'm very passionate about. I'm very stoked that now I'm actually able to study it in my new position. It's going to be part of a study that I'm working on. I don't know if we're going to yield insights that are critically like, it's not like a bodybuilding sleep study, so folks listening it might not be as cool as it sounds when I just throw it out there like that, at least for your purposes. But no, I think sleep is so critically important, and a lot of people overlook it. It's easy to say, okay, something in my life has to give. Sleep is the easiest one to cut. You just say, whatever, I'll push through because I want to make time for family and work and leisure time and all the other stuff, right? But man, sleep can be so important for building muscle, for losing fat. I mean, there's studies indicating that folks who get more sleep and higher quality sleep, for every pound they lose, a greater percentage of it tends to be fat rather than lean mass. So there's studies with hypertrophy, with fat loss, and you just feel better. You cognitively perform better, right? Like there's just so much that goes into, so much we get from sleep and so much that goes into sleeping well. Now, if you're one of those people that, you hit the pillow and you're out, great. That's fantastic. But I've had periods of my life where I really struggled with sleep, and I've had to build up some different, really dig into the literature and figure out, okay, what are some things that you can do to actually, help yourself? But sometimes it's so difficult to overcome. I mean, getting back to the conversation about bodybuilding, I don't know if I've previously mentioned this on the air, but the most recent time I prepped, I got very, very lean, best I ever looked on stage. Everything went well. And, I would chat with people. I looked ill, I was very lean at the end. And they'd say, oh, you must be so hungry. That's got to be terrible. And I was like, I'm not, the hunger hasn't bothered me at all. I'm really haven't been that hungry. It's been fine. And they're like, everyone kind of assumed that must be the thing that's so hard, or like the desire to kind of cheat on your diet, all the cravings. And I'm like, I haven't really been doing a lot of cravings. Like I've been fine. The thing that was absolutely brutal and just, I couldn't tolerate it. It was ruining my quality of life. I couldn't sleep a wink, man. And there's analogous situations where, like, I know with mice studies, when they get really hungry, sometimes they have a foraging response where they get extra active and stuff, and instead of just like chilling out, they start running around the cage and trying to find food and stuff. And yeah, I mean, the lack of sleep was just brutal, and it was so hard to. I failed. Like in normal instances where I could, do like good sleep hygiene and maybe some targeted supplementation and some relaxation stuff before bed. In typical circumstances, I've got a good system in place where I'm like, okay, I know I can improve my sleep quality here. When it came to prep, there was nothing I could do to overcome that sleep disruption. I mean, I was getting 3.5, sometimes 4 hours. And it was to the point where I couldn't just lay in bed because like I was working on my PhD at the time. I had stuff to do. So I would literally like do a ritual before bed. Like sleep hygiene is not even the word for it. It was a genuine ritual to do everything I could to optimize my sleep. I would lay down, and then like 2 in the morning, 2 a.m., eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. And I'd just be like, screw it, man. I guess I'll go to work. Like my day has started, whether I like it or not. So, yeah, man, that whole like period of time, it was just like me and the folks who worked on campus, like the overnight shift, like, and they would see me and it was like they saw a ghost. They're like, what is someone doing here? And it was like, yeah, I just go to work at 2:30 in the morning because what else are you going to do, man? It was brutal. But yeah, sleep is one of those things where it's like when you're sleeping well, you take it for granted, but it's so important to fitness. And when you can't sleep well, oh, it's the worst. I would take hunger over sleep deprivation 1,000,000 times out of 10.
You know, it's crazy. From now, so tracking the by the same tools, I'm between 5 to 6 hours, if not a little bit more. So it's shifting absolutely in the right direction, and the quality of everything I could say feels like night and day. And from having various periods in my life, let's say mild insomnia or being like a light sleeper even as a child, I would take getting good quality sleep and just like cravings any day of the week versus let's say having zero cravings, but then experiencing a lot of sleep deprivation. So I'd love Trex to do an episode at some point on that. Would be fantastic. My either like employers or the people that I work with, they call like jokingly the Omar text, which is like the 5 a.m. or like set like 5, 3, or 7 a.m. where I'll just be obviously in bed, not able to sleep, and I'd be like, hey, like whatever, just FYI, like just in the morning, don't respond now. Like I'm just, I'm just working through, like trying to keep myself occupied, so it's terrible. I do assume, Trex, real quick before we wrap up and go back to testosterone, that I assume the combination of, and I don't mean this any which way to you or anyone else. It's just a general observation. When prepping to that point where you're so lean, there's something that occurs that I feel maybe even if you get good sleep, that you just don't look well. Like it's like maybe it's just that a fellow human can perceive like you are really low body fat, so you kind of just look, not you, but again, people like disorganized. There's some, maybe it's a feral look in that. I'm not sure what comes together, but like someone can see someone in prep at some theoretical point and like you don't look well. So you see like Trex getting his PhD coming in the middle of the night in prep too. Like, what are they thinking,
Yeah. And it was like, my thyroid hormone was like 0. So it was, July. And I was wearing 2 sweatshirts in the South, right?
What
like
I mean. Yeah,
people were just like, what is happening? And I was still freezing. And I think, humans, we don't have much from an evolutionary perspective. We don't have claws and talons. We're not exceptional physical specimens relative to the animal kingdom. But I tell you what, man, we're good at recognizing patterns.
Yes.
And we have good visual acuity, relatively speaking. Not great, but good. And so I think that humans are just really good. Like, we have this visceral response when we see our fellow man or woman and they just don't look okay, right?
Yeah.
And so like when you're in that state, you don't look okay because like physiologically you are not in a great spot. And so I do think that there is some kind of visceral reaction where like someone would look at me and say, I don't know what's going on, but I know I don't like it. And I know that Eric doesn't look so good. And so I know I've mentioned this on various podcasts in the past, but when I was like just getting ready for a show, like really close to stage time, I'm looking, you're thinking bodybuilding mode, you know what the judge is like. And I'm thinking, I look great. I am looking very good. Lucky folks who get to see me every day. And the word got around through the department, people chatting at the water cooler, a little bit of gossiping here and there. A very nice person who worked in the office had been asking around because they thought I was dying. Like they thought I was sick. And they were like the person who, like, honestly, not to make light of it, but like if someone in the department was gonna like write the announcement that like, hey, Eric's going away for a while, we're gonna send him some flowers at his house, she would have been involved in that. And I really wonder if she was planning all of those different activities associated with my extended illness and potential demise, to be completely honest. So yeah, she was asking around with my friends like, "Hey, is Eric okay? Is he gonna pull through?" And they're like, "Yeah, he's apparently an athlete. He fancies himself." So
the,
yeah,
the
not great.
the things that we do for our own passions. I love it. I can't wait. The Trex lore, okay, is so yes, having you on, being able to talk the science, be a highly effective communicator, great. The Trex lore, though, as we uncover more, and keep in mind, we know nothing of Trex from 12
Yeah.
and below, and some would say that that lends itself to the vat theory. We're calling it the great vat theory concerning Trex. Like, when was he born? Actually, was he born a 12-year-old? As an example. Um, Let's circle back though to wrap up the episode, Trex, because we've gone a lot of different places concerning testosterone, nutritional changes and its role on testosterone, body composition changes, its role on testosterone, body composition or high adiposity and muscle building potential. When that theoretical point occurs, when it comes to experiencing lower testosterone as one gets leaner, is there anything you kind of want to circle back to, either the hormones, anything whatsoever, where you're just like, like, oh, I really wish we covered this. Time to start promoting our oyster endeavor for high testosterone. I don't know. You tell me.
I think one of the things that's fascinating about testosterone, and we can generalize that to kind of sex hormones in general, is I rarely tell someone in fitness, your testosterone level, for example, is what's holding us back, right? So with that in mind, you'd think that I would rarely be, going, oh, what can we do to kind of increase testosterone? What kind of levers can we pull here? However, when you look at the behavioral things we can do to try to create a physiological environment that's conducive to optimal testosterone levels or sex hormone levels, what you find is a lot of very good advice. And so it's really interesting because I don't look at testosterone as something that is like the objective, like our goal is to do what we can to increase testosterone a little bit. But I do think if we're doing the things that would increase our testosterone a little bit, we are probably going to feel better and perform better and just be an overall monster, right? So like when you think about some of the things we discussed in here, eating a well-rounded diet with plenty of micronutrients and a moderate macronutrient distribution, that's just generally good advice for, eat some vegetables, get a little protein in, don't get too crazy in either direction. Just eat in moderation and get some balance in your diet, right? That's just generally good advice. Be active, but not too active, right? Exercise some, but don't overtrain. That's just good advice, right? Sleep enough and sleep well. Again, we're just talking about doing stuff that you deep down inherently know is just good for you, right? Yeah. And so I don't think that people should necessarily be fretting, even like, maintain a moderate body composition level, right? Not trying to stay absolutely shredded for years on end, and also not getting too high into, elevated levels of adiposity if you are able to manage your body weight effectively. And if you're not, then you still want to do weight neutral things like we just mentioned, right? Because I know some people, it's very, very challenging to change, to get their adiposity level down. And not everyone has the same experience when trying to do a fat loss effort. So all of that is to say, I don't think a lot of people should be saying, I really need to focus on increasing my testosterone by 50 nanograms per deciliter. But if more people implemented more of these things, they'd feel better, they'd perform better, their body composition would be probably more conducive with a lot of their goals, and they might notice that their testosterone happens to go up at the same time.
Trex, this is, folks, I didn't say it in the previous episode, and I don't know why. I was maybe just stunned by how good it was, but this is a monster episode. That's the hallmark, okay, of our own culture. We're turning everyone here, doesn't matter who, into monsters, the most dominant physical monster on the field or on the mat, because coming up in the next episode with Eric Trexler, we're going to be divining the secrets to becoming a fantastic wrestler. When you strung together those phrases, like there's 9 of them in a row about wrestling positions, I knew you were for real. I thought I might pull a joke on you the first time that we met and try to pull like a single leg takedown on you. I now know that is definitely not the right choice if I want to live, especially if we're in some sort of concrete surface like area. If it's a kind of grassy surface, maybe sand, I'll be okay. Maybe a strained neck, but like concrete, probably don't want to do it.
You got to watch out too, especially I was a defensive specialist, and if you're going for a head inside single leg takedown, I hit the illegal moves too. You might be looking at a broomstick. I think they banned that one after I got out of high school, but when I was in high school, that was totally legal. Okay, so keep an eye on your ACL.
Trex, let me just say, imagine this comes out as part of the Trex lore. The Trex, like it's a known thing, like he was actually like a really good wrestler, really good defensive wrestler. But what he's never mentioned before is that he actually was excommunicated from being a wrestler due to an illegal move he pulled, kind of like, Karate Kid. So I'll fill you like if you don't like. We're like it's the final showdown. It's for everything, the championship, and you sweep the leg. Like you do the move that you're not supposed to, but it gets you the win. Imagine the Trex lore reveals that. What a revelation that'd be.
It's like with Simone Biles, where they're like, "Hey, we need to ban that stuff she's doing because no one else can do it." Like with me, they were rewriting the rule books as we were going because I was just a menace, just absolutely dirty. And eventually, they just exiled from the sport.
Last little insight. I'll share a funny story. So the gym owner of the gym I've gone to for many years for his fitness, Sean, cool dude. So he really got into Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I will give him credit. He started doing it way before that pathway of retired powerlifter to Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner was a thing. Like I'm talking 2012, like he's been doing it. Anyways, I saw him and his instructor, his BJJ instructor, who actually knows Sambo, and I like Sambo a lot. Respect, it kind of combines various disciplines. So like grappling, striking, so on and so forth. Igor is his name anyways. So I'm hearing them talk. And Sean is a very no-nonsense guy. Like he has a lot of, let's just say, lived experiences in a variety of scenarios. I would call him tough of character. Anyways, so he was asking his instructor, his BJJ instructor, about various moves, kind of like yourself with wrestling. And he said, Igor, I have a question for you. I thought of this move last night. He thinks it, like he's so passionate about it, he's like thinking about it at night, like whatever. So he comes in to try and show his instructor the new move. I'm dead serious. And it basically turns into, for people to know what it is, like essentially kind of like a neck crank. And so Igor, I'm not going to do a thick Russian accent, but he said, you can do that. He's like, but that would kill someone. Like that is an illegal move. And Sean was like, oh okay, right. No, okay. No, I was just curious. But he hadn't thought all the way through. But he's so excited to share with an instructor, like a theory. He's like, I don't think someone could defend against this. And it's like, you may be right. It's like, that is why it is illegal. You can actually cause bodily harm, but a similar way.
Yeah. Coming up with moves in the combat sports, most of the good stuff's been done. Most of the stuff you're going to come up with is either ineffective or extremely dangerous.
Oh, man. I'm enjoying this part. So I'll wrap it up there. I will say thank you to my co-host, Eric Trexler, for being back on. We have Kai, shout out to Kai, who's doing the timestamps, everything relevant. So the Trex Nation, I want to see you once again in the comment section. Eric Trexler for himself, where to follow him, that is linked in the top link down below. We are back every single insert date here. It's been Monday, folks, these days. You can go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out, we think. We read them on occasion. We genuinely appreciate everyone's support, and we'll catch you in that next episode. Until next time.